work is about supporting working people. I do that by supporting workers who want to organize unions and join unions. The most common question I get when I tell people what I do is, how did you get involved with unions? Don't they support lazy workers? To dispel some of the misinformation out there, allow me to share my story. When I started working for one of America's most powerful unions, I didn't know much. My business textbook in college simply said something like, unions stifle productivity and competition. The textbooks were wrong. For example, UPS employees, union employees, FedEx employees are not union. Both companies are doing just fine. The union my coworkers and I built, Progressive Workers Union, is decentralized and our membership is young and diverse. But more on that later. If you look online, you can easily find plenty of propaganda about how unions are old school institutions. It's not as easy to find information about the pride that union workers have in the work that they do. So it can get confusing. The truth is that American unions are responsible for creating the weekend and child labor laws, as well as reducing the American work week to 40 hours. It's also true that labor law has been constructed to exclude immigrant workers and black workers from union membership. Despite these hurdles, a major share of union membership is made up of those very same workers. For example, many unionized federal employees are African American. In fact, women and minorities now account for more than half of union membership in the United States. It's time to expand our limited vision of working class beyond stereotypes. Black workers have long led the struggle for racial justice within the organized labor movement. For example, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis while supporting sanitation workers, union sanitation workers, that were protesting against the death of one of their AFSCME union brothers. If you watch the NFL, NBA, MLB, or any other major sport, you're watching union members compete. Did you know that airline pilots, graduate students, teachers, and even Hollywood actors are union members as well? And that union membership raises standards for all of these important fields of work? When I learned all of this, the textbook's claims appeared inaccurate and incomplete, especially because there didn't seem to be any productivity or competitiveness issues in any of these industries I just mentioned, as well as very little detail around labor history. When I took the job at the union, I became a member of a staff union that protected my rights as an employee. If my employer overstepped my authority, I would reach out to my union steward and make sure I was being treated fairly according to my contract. My job as a union represented employee lifted me into the middle class by paying me my best salary up until that point. Suddenly, I had money in my pocket, benefits to cover my health care if I got sick, and I was able to start growing a financial nest egg. For the first time, I could think about my future instead of worrying about tomorrow. After working for the union for a few years, I decided to create a startup to help workers organize and build power online. My decision was reaffirmed very recently when workers at a 6,000 employee Amazon warehouse lost their closely watched bid to form a union in Bessemer, Alabama. Amazon, like other multi-billion-dollar corporations such as Tesla and Walmart before them, have all been accused of running aggressive anti-union campaigns to pressure employees to vote against unionization. Still, 65% of Americans approve of labor unions according to Gallup. Many corporations have made a calculation that is easier and cheaper to resist letting your employees freely organize as a union than to deal with their collective demands and collective bargaining. Much of the propaganda against unions can be traced directly back to a memo written by Lewis Powell in 1971 to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce entitled A Corporate Blueprint to Dominate Democracy. However, to understand a fuller picture, you have to look back even further to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. That was intended to systemically weaken protection for workers against company abuses during union organizing campaigns. This largely took back gains workers had made in 1935 with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA. So my decision to go all in supporting workers coincided with the resurgence of interest in unionization for a new generation of workers, political campaign staff, Nonprofit employees, software engineers, video game developers, and journalists have all successfully organized unions in the last few years. According to the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, beginning in 2017, about 76% of the increase in union membership was workers under the age of 35. Also, in 2017, my company was covered in Fast Company and Forbes, as well as other national outlets, in an article called "The Millennial Who's Trying to Save the Labor Movement." The title makes me laugh a little bit because, as most articles in the world that come out with the name millennial in it, garner global attention. However, it's obvious one person cannot save a movement. We need workers everywhere to begin fighting for the right to organize, and there is a long history of workers fighting for a better life. So I represent a new class of labor leader, ready to use technology and organizing to build a labor movement rooted in intersectionality rather than just class struggle. So when I first, was mentioned in the Fast Company article, I was still employed at Sierra Club, America's largest environmental organization. As a new employee, I worked on labor issues, and my coworkers elected me president of John Muir Local 100 in hopes that I could help them improve their wages, benefits, and working conditions. Ironically, staff at nonprofits often suffer from a lack of job security, unpaid overtime, and low wages. So before we could do all the organizing, we had to rebuild our union into an organization focused on equity, as well as racial and gender justice, particularly for women of color who were historically mistreated and underpaid. One of the first things we put on our membership voting docket was to vote as an independent union for changing our name from John Muir Local 100 to Progressive Workers Union to move away from the racist history of John Muir. He was a founder of Sierra Club over 100 years prior. So our activism caused the Sierra Club to face its founder's past and rebuke him as well, much like America is now facing the legacy of the Confederacy and its leaders. From that point, it took 6 months of organizing, strategic campaigning by PWU members, union leaders, and our sister union, Sierra Employee Alliance. But we were able to create a historic contract that extended membership to hundreds of our other coworkers and other workers outside of PWU and raised our working conditions considerably. The fight was long and painful with many sacrifices, but we did it. The result was a clearer and more uniform relationship between our management and labor. The next group of union leaders after I stepped down from leadership have only made PWU stronger and expanded the union to represent employees at other environmental nonprofits and nonprofits. PWU still represents some of the most amazing and progressive union members in our country. So at this point, 3 years later, 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, millions of jobs disappeared overnight and lines for food got longer in cities and towns across America. Suddenly, jobs like teaching and restaurant work became dangerous and unreliable. Jobs that had traditionally been overlooked by society became visible and more clearly crucial to our survival as a nation. These jobs put workers at greater risk than the usual for illness and death. Workers tasked with carrying out these jobs are called essential workers. For months, during the early days of the pandemic, we applauded the sacrifice these workers were making, even as they were denied access to PPE like gloves and masks. Without union protection, during the pandemic, these workers were forced to fend for themselves. Now, drivers at companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash are not guaranteed the rights and protections that employees at traditional companies enjoy. These folks who work for companies that are classified as independent contractors rather than employees, so they don't get lunch breaks or sick days. That means if a driver gets ill or takes time off to have a child, they're not eligible for vacation or paternity leave. From the very early days of the pandemic, Instacart served as a lifeline while we socially distanced, picking up our most private items like groceries. Only a year later, in January 2021, Instacart announced that it was firing 2,000 other companies' 10,000 delivery drivers. Many complained that the firings were intended to slow an effort by Instacart shoppers who had recently voted to form a union. Now keep in mind, workers who do get jobs are literally risking their lives so that we can live ours in the safety of our homes. As they enter grocery stores, interact with store employees, pass by other store patrons, and finally reach our doorstep, they've rolled the dice multiple times. The reality isn't much better for rideshare drivers. Despite the essential value of their work and the premium we pay to use these services, many gig workers are still living in poverty as working poor, receiving low wages and little to no benefits. Even worse, gig drivers are increasingly at risk of robbery and physical attack during the current economic downturn. For example, Mohammed Anwar, a 66-year-old Pakistani immigrant, started delivering food after his limousine business slowed during the pandemic. Mr. Anwar was allegedly killed by two girls aged 13 and 15, so really young, during an attempted carjacking in Washington, D.C. This is a terrifying event and just an example of what can happen to gig workers when they don't have adequate safety protections. And frankly, this sickened me, and it should sicken you too. To remedy the precarious situation these workers are facing, they've been organizing themselves into collectives and pushing for legislation to fix a broken gig economy with a business model that exploits them. In response, these major companies, flush with cash, have been hiring anti-union consultants, and Uber and Lyft have been spending millions of dollars to lobby against legislation locally that would define gig workers as employees. How would the reality of Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart drivers look if they were members of a union? To answer that question, we look to essential workers like nurses, teachers, grocery store employees, and bus drivers. While these workers were also hard hit by the pandemic, unions acted as a strong voice advocating for safer conditions and proactive COVID testing for their members. New York teachers unions threatened to sick out and successfully forced New York schools to close. Pilot unions struck agreements to offer partial pay after shutdowns because of flight cuts, and actors unions pushed for protections for members impacted by shutdowns. Union represented meatpacking employees are also essential workers and were hit particularly hard from the beginning of the pandemic. By September 13, 2020, at least 42,000 meatpacking workers had tested positive for coronavirus in 494 different meat plants. At least 203 of these workers had died since March, making it some of the most dangerous work in the entire country. So unions representing meatpacking employees advocated for mass social distancing, increased safety measures like vaccination, and they were able to temporarily shut down facilities with outbreaks and gain increased safety measures. They also got paid time off that allowed folks to get vaccinated as quickly as possible. So what does this all mean? Am I saying that unions are the perfect solution to every problem we face as a country? No. However, unions are currently the most publicly favored solution to problems created by corporations who treat their employees as a liability rather than an asset. The pandemic has brought to plain view the exploitation workers have been suffering through for over 50 years and provides an opportunity to fundamentally change how America works. Not everyone will become a union leader, but we all have the power to advocate for vulnerable communities of workers. So what can you do? First of all, learn which companies are union, right? Which ones have union workers and support them. Demand that our local political leaders show a real commitment to supporting working people, and ask your representatives to support Protect the Right to Organize Act, also known as the PRO Act, or pass similar legislation locally. According to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, the United States ranks number 13 on the list of the most unionized countries, far behind Iceland, Sweden, and Belgium. It's very embarrassing. The PRO Act offers a chance to change all that. So as far as gig workers are concerned, just this week, Marty Walsh, Secretary of Labor, acknowledged that in a lot of cases, workers should be classified as employees, which is huge. We all have a responsibility, not just as a consumer, but as a community member, to be aware of how we are impacting others. We must demand that gig workers are supported, and the ones that we patronize, the gig companies we patronize, we insist that they pay family-sustaining wages and allow the workers to join and form unions when they want them. The next time you use a gig app, remember that there is a person on the other side of that transaction. And when a bill comes up in your area to support gig workers being classified as employees, vote for it. Gig workers are essential workers fulfilling a service and receiving a low wage and possibly no benefits in return. If we continue to underpay workers who provide our country such important services, we will continue to see the American dream turning into a nightmare for millions of American workers. Thank you.